My name is Michael Sully, and me and my friend were the sole survivors of a horrific event. It's been nearly 40 years now, and until recently, I was sure this story would never see the light of day. It was only after my recent visit to the doctor, where I received some very bad news, that I was suddenly struck with a certain sense of sentimentality for what happened. It sounds odd, I know. Don't get me wrong, what happened was horrible, and I would do anything in the world for it not to have occurred. But alas, that isn't possible. What happened happened, and as it stands, I don't feel as if I can let this particular tale be lost to the sands of time. So I'm writing this here, now, in the hopes that after I'm gone, the tragedy that occurred can be remembered. And, who knows, perhaps others have been through similar things. It would be nice to know I'm not alone. Anyway, I'm getting off track. I'm sure you're itching to hear what I'm on about, right? It all started at a party. I was only 22 at the time, recently returned to university after a long year of traveling the Americas. My friends were glad to see me, and as soon as the weekend rolled around I could hardly say no to a good old-fashioned night out. Unbeknownst to me, my friends invited friends of their own, and some of those friends asked their own friends to come along. When the day arrived, what began as a small get-together between a tightly knit group of 5 friends had turned into a romping boozer with a group of 11 or 12, half of which I didn't know at all. Although I was a little disheartened at not being able to catch up with my friends as intimately as I had hoped, the company did turn out to be quite endearing. Between 5 hours, 7 bars, and more taxi fares than I care to remember, I drank, made conversation, and bonded with these newcomers. It felt as if within 1 week of returning, I had, in fact, made more friends than I had in the 3 years of college prior. As the end of the night rolled around, our group exited the final bar, laughing and chatting amongst ourselves. The atmosphere felt giddy, and yet very calm. As the small white van we'd called to take us back to the dorm rattled slowly to a stop at the curve, we bid a drunken goodbye to those of us heading in a different direction and opened its back doors, stepping inside the gloomy interior of the vehicle. The van wasn't quite tall enough for most of us to stand, so we ducked down and laughed as we scraped our heads against the roof until we eventually fell into our seats at the side. My best friend, Joel, sat opposite me, staring at me with a gormless smile that made me laugh. As I leaned my head back against the smooth surface of the van's wall, I opened my mouth and beamed back, not just at him, but at everyone in the van, even the middle-aged, balding driver who turned to us from the front seat and asked where we wanted to go. Someone else answered him, while I simply lay back and basked in the glory of the universe. For the first time in my life, I felt truly happy. It was a strange experience, as if realizing that every positive emotion you've ever felt had simply been a fake, a pale imitation of the true sensation which I was only now feeling. I was so grateful for the present, which felt utterly flawless, so hopeful for the future, which seemed brighter than ever, and so forgiving of the past, which now felt like nothing but a rocky road leading to my ultimate destination in the here and now. It was nothing less than euphoric. As my friend's drunken chatter became background noise in my enlightened mind, I breathed in deep and disappeared into pure ecstasy. The next moments felt like they lasted an eternity, and at the same time, they flashed before my eyes in a matter of moments. I daren't try to explain it further. It makes no more sense to me than it does to you. With that same carefree, stupid smile on my face and the gentle rumbling of the engine passing through my bones, I sat there, feeling like I had never felt before. Then, the noise stopped. I don't quite know how to describe it. 1 second, my ears were filled with the muffled sounds of traffic and the hum of the van, and then, nothing. The vibrations passing through the vehicle ceased as well, sending a chill through my body just before the whole thing lurched forward. It felt like a descending elevator slowing to a stop far too quick. I, like almost everyone else in the van, was jolted upwards, making a resounding thump against the roof as my head smashed against it. As we fell back down into our seats and the world fell still again, our eyes began to wander between each other. Now, I know it may seem stupid given what had just happened, but every single one of us still had a smile on our face. The feeling I felt, what we must all have felt, was like a pull, drawing us into ecstasy and refusing to let us go, refusing to even acknowledge the possibility that anything bad might have happened. Despite that, my naturally curious nature beckoned me to stand up from my seat and poke my head between the backs of the driver and passenger seats to see into the front of the vehicle. The driver, looking even older and frilier than he did before, lay face down against the steering wheel, unconscious. Buzzed as I was, I reached forward and grabbed his shoulder, shaking him gently while muttering something totally inappropriate to the situation. I can't remember exactly, but I assume I jokingly told him he needed to get more sleep, or to wake up so he could join the party. It wasn't until I finally raised my head and saw out of the windscreen that my smile finally faded. What I saw was only darkness. No rear lights from the cars ahead or glaring yellow from street lamps, no traffic lights or buildings. I saw only black. At first I assumed a logical explanation, that the van had crashed into something black, or a blanket had been tossed over the windshield, forcing the driver to brake. But as my eyes narrowed and I leaned in closer, I was proven wrong. It wasn't just darkness. It was more nuanced than that. The more I stared, the more I could make out other colors. Brown, sickly green, and purple, floating and blending like clouds in a nebula. I turned around to my friends, suddenly concerned, although the feeling of euphoria still lingered somewhere in me. They were still buzzing, a couple now drunkenly stumbling toward the back doors. When Joel reached for the handle and pulled, my eyes went wide. Before I could leap forward or shout a warning, the two doors at the back of the van swung open, suddenly revealing an all too vivid window into the horrid void I had seen through the front. The air did not change. No wind flew in from the outside, nor did it vent from within. Save for the suddenly looming sight of this seemingly infinite expanse just beyond the safety of our small shuttle, nothing seemed to have changed. Even the van, which was clearly no longer on solid ground, did not shift or tilt. It was perfectly still, and by that point, so was I. Joel slowly turned around, a mumbly chuckle beginning to reach up from his throat. I couldn't possibly understand what he was so jolly about, but I knew immediately something was very wrong. As his head turned, his eyes met with mine, and I saw a sight that haunts me to this very day. Joel's eyes were inky black, shiny and reflective enough that I could see myself clearly in them. They were leaking viscous, black fluid, flowing down his face like tears. He wasn't crying though. His mouth was still upturned, a grin so wide I could see his lips trembling from the strain. He stared at me, the rest of his body unnaturally still. At this point, I could see a few of the others had noticed, but strangely, none of them seemed concerned, except for Harry, a lanky man I'd met only that day. The others' expressions were shifting, twitching, as if some internal battle was taking place to decide how they should feel about this horrifying situation. I was dumbfounded, paralyzed on the spot. As I fell still, Joel began to move again. He turned around and stepped closer to the edge of the van, practically teetering over the abyss. Then, he turned to face me one final time. Even though I'm certain his mouth was already as wide as it could go, I could have sworn that he smiled at me at that moment. A smile that meant more than simply what was on his face. Without a word, he stepped out into the void. He didn't fall like I expected him to. He simply hovered there, floating slowly away as his other foot let go of the van and his body became wholly unsupported. I did nothing. I merely watched in abject horror as my best friend was snatched by the abyss. That is my biggest regret to this day. Suddenly, my attention was stolen away as another friend of mine, Elsa, snickered. It was an infectious laugh, one that demanded reciprocation. I was so terrified that it had no effect on me, but I could see the others struggling to hold in laughs of their own. One by one, they succumbed, giggling and wheezing as a bout of laughter overtook them. Their stifled smiles were broken wide open into huge grins, and I could see as their eyes darkened, as a thick liquid began to seep from them, and they slowly rose from their seats, making their way to the back of the van. Only Harry remained in his seat, now suddenly fighting for control over his face as the twitchings of a smile assaulted his visage. I was frozen, forced to watch as the others stepped out into the void one by one, floating away into the infinite void. Some of them twirled as they flew, others turned around and grinned at me as they mimed swimming through the air. It was entertaining. I know I'll sound sadistic saying that, but at the time, that was just how it felt. Even with all my fear, I could still understand how they were feeling. The world seemed so wonderful in that moment, so much so that nothing could be looked at in a negative way. The void was dark, but it looked comfy. Their eyes were black, an amazingly dark black the likes of which I'd never seen. I felt the smile begin to rise on my lips, but I quickly pushed it away. I held my mouth tight and blinked rapidly, my heart beating out of my chest faster and faster. As I fought that battle, I saw Harry finally succumb to his urge. He stood, eyes already taken by the darkness, and made his way towards the back of the van. As his foot stepped from the edge, I finally broke free of my shock and dashed forward, grabbing his arm and pulling him back with all of my strength. His face stared back at me, grinning as if I was the mad one, ruining his fun. I pulled with all my might, grabbing one of the van's doors with my other hand as I tried to shut off his escape. The pull outside was so strong, yet it wasn't the slightest bit physical. My face was still twitching, and a warm feeling in my belly beckoned me out into the darkness. However, every time I looked out, my mind raced back to Joel. My best friend, the man whom I had had so many good memories with, taken from me. I refused to succumb to the blind comfort, the false hope. As I pulled with all my might, finally starting to make progress, my eyes were drawn to something within the void. Something now far away in its depths, still floating ever farther. To my utter terror, it was Joel, his body straight as he floated slowly down into the gloom. His hand was moving, and it took me a second to realize what he was doing. With that unnatural grin still on his face, he was waving at me. At that moment, I couldn't take it any longer. I pulled and pulled, and eventually was able to wrench Harry back into the van. As he fell onto his back, I grabbed the doors and slammed them shut. When they connected and sealed the exit, the whole van shuddered again, the overhead lights flickering on for a moment, then on and off repeatedly. I could see the whole van shaking each time it lit up, until, suddenly, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed. I jumped up screaming at first. Or, at least, that's what the nurses said. It's a fuzzy memory for me. All I remember is the bright, glaring lights, the stark white walls and the warmth of the hospital instilling me with dread. When I came to my senses, the doctors explained that I'd been found in an alleyway with severe bruising and several muscular tears. I asked them about Harry and the van, but they seemed to know nothing about it. I was found alone. I didn't even try to tell them what had happened. I knew they wouldn't believe me, and could have done without being locked up in a psychiatric unit. I stayed in the hospital for a few days before I was discharged, and the first thing I did was try to find Harry. It took me almost a week, but I did eventually track him down. He was in a hospital in a completely different part of the city, miles and miles away from mine, and even further from the place the van had picked us up. He was so relieved to hear my voice when I visited. His eyes remained black, the doctors diagnosing him with some condition or other to explain his sudden and total blindness. Only we knew the truth, and Harry, too, seemed inclined to keep it a secret. He never did get his vision back. For the first few months, I looked after him as got used to his new condition. Although he eventually moved away to be with family, we did keep in touch until his passing some years ago. As for myself, I spent a lot of my time after that researching events similar to mine, desperate to make sense of what had happened. I never found anything, and was eventually forced to give up. I tried my best to go back to living a normal life, and for the most part, I succeeded. Though, every time I see a white van rolling down the street, I still feel my stomach drop. It's irrational, I know. I'm as certain as anything that the van, and the driver had nothing to do with it. The fault, if anything, was ours. It pains me to think that we, in our youthful arrogance, doomed that innocent man to a fate still unknown. And that concludes my story. I know most of you reading won't believe it, and that's fine. I just hope that one day it can serve as a comfort for the next person who finds themselves a survivor of that horrid place. And remember, because this part is important. If you ever find yourself in a moment where you are so blissfully happy, a moment that seems to transport you, one you feel like you could stay in forever. Whatever you do, don't smile.